Topic 42, World War I. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to identify 3 reasons why the United States entered World War I, name the president and years during American participation in World War I, explain 3 changes that the U.S. experienced during the war, and describe 3 effects that emerged in the U.S. after the war. By the early 20th century, the system of alliances that emerged out of the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th began to weaken. Tensions stemming from overseas imperialism, increased militarization, and intensified ethnic nationalism finally erupted in June 1914. War broke out between the Triple Entente, or Great Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance on the other side, composed of Germany, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Eventually, the United States and other nations joined the Entente, which became known as the Allies. The Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria joined the latter, and the 5 became known as the Central Powers. The United States maintained a formal policy of neutrality from 1914 through April 1917. However, it held close cultural ties with Great Britain and lent money to Britain and France, who in turn purchased supplies like ammunition and food from the United States. As a result, American industrial output increased by almost 1/3 between 1914 and 1917, and its GNP, or gross national product, increased by 20%. These industrial and financial gains continued beyond the end of the war. Bethlehem Steel, for example, took advantage of supplying both sides with armaments prior to 1917 and grew to become the U.S. government's biggest supplier of naval ships by the 1940s. Many groups within American society supported neutrality. Pacifists, those who support peace for moral reasons, included progressive reformers Jane Addams and Robert La Follette, Secretary of State and former populist William Jennings Bryan, and industrialist Henry Ford. Socialists like Eugene V. Debs characterized the conflict as a capitalist one and urged workers to avoid it. Because cultural and financial ties connected the United States more closely to Britain and France, the war was opposed by German Americans. Irish Americans who resented Britain's own interference into the affairs of Ireland also managed to convince President Woodrow Wilson to stay neutral until 1917. Nevertheless, a series of events ultimately convinced the man who ran for a second term in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," to request a declaration of war against Germany and, several months later, its ally, Austria-Hungary. First, reports of German atrocities in Belgium colored American attitudes against Germany. Schools cut German language programs. Symphonies stopped playing works by German composers. Everyday Americans changed the names of food with German names. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, for example, and Frankfurters became hot dogs. Some German Americans, such as this man who was tarred and feathered, were victimized because other Americans perceived them as unsupportive of the war effort, or worse, spies for Germany. German aggression in the North Atlantic lay behind the second reason for U.S. involvement in the war. As German U-boats or submarines began to sink ocean liners like the RMS Lusitania in an attempt to starve the British, They violated neutrality of the seas, which would have enabled American merchants to continue to profit from shipping goods to both sides. More importantly, Americans viewed Germany's torpedoing of civilian vessels as barbaric because innocents died. Lastly, Germany promised to help Mexico regain some of the territory it had lost in the Mexican-American War if it joined Germany against a possible U.S. alliance with the British and French. When the Zimmermann telegram was intercepted and published in early 1917, popular American opinion became enraged and finally supported U.S. involvement on the Allies' side. In April 1917, Wilson managed to convince Congress that the United States needed to make the world safe for democracy by checking German aggression as an ally of France and Britain. This philosophical reason behind American entry into World War I can be seen as an extension of Wilson's progressive idealism into the realm of foreign affairs. The United States itself experienced some drastic changes during the approximately 18 months of its involvement in the war. Wilson's government recruited titans of industry to direct American labor, food, savings, hearts, and minds during the war. George Creel's Committee on Public Information churned out visual and audio propaganda to bolster domestic support for the war. America's large immigrant population and children were especially targeted by the nationalistic imagery. Future President Herbert Hoover instructed average Americans on how to economize so that surpluses could be sent to feed and clothe the Allies. Young men were required by the Selective Service Act of 1917 to register for the draft, while those at home were urged to lend the government money by buying war bonds. Though the United States' direct participation in World War I was brief, it ushered in some profound changes to American life. First, American industry and banking, which had in large part outfitted and financed the Allies since 1914, continued to thrive through the 1920s. Women who had filled vacancies in factories created by soldiers, sailors, and Marines, unfortunately, were fired once the men returned. Nevertheless, this work made it possible for President Wilson and Congress to ignore suffrage activists' long fight. And so women finally received the right to vote in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Thousands of African Americans who had served in segregated but decorated units that were hailed as heroes by the French during the war created vibrant new communities in Harlem and Chicago when they refused to return to the horrors of the Jim Crow South. The Great Migration North, however, engendered resentment in some northern communities unaccustomed to large numbers of Black residents. For example, Chicago endured a race riot in 1919, while the KKK and lynching, long confined to the South, began to emerge in the North and Midwest after the war. From places like Detroit and Long Island, the Klan targeted Jews and Catholics in addition to African Americans. As this last development suggests, the U.S. took an ominous turn toward nativism, xenophobia, and fear-mongering after the events of 1917. Political and business leaders such as Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Ford encouraged immigrants to renounce their quote-unquote hyphenated identities because they feared not only espionage, but also political radicalism among the foreign-born. Ford forbade his employees from speaking languages other than English on the shop floor. Fearing a communist revolution, such as the one that broke out in Russia in 1917, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer deported immigrant labor activists like Emma Goldman and harassed many others in his raids of 1919. The right to free speech, damaged heavily by the wartime passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 18, respectively, continued to be curtailed during the 1920s. Forming part of the first Red Scare, these laws allowed President Wilson to jail those like socialist Eugene V. Debs, whose pacifism drove him to interfere with draft registrations, as well as those whose political beliefs were considered radical and dangerous to American democracy. In all, while the war stimulated the United States industrial economy and some new political opportunities for women, it also exacerbated existing racial, ethnic, and ideological tensions within the United States. In the realm of foreign affairs, World War I cemented the United States' role as and perhaps as the, major player on the world stage, as this political cartoon suggests. As a victor, the U.S. got to shape the terms of peace. President Wilson's 14 points informed the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war in Europe, even if the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it or to join the League of Nations, the international peacekeeping body that was Wilson's own brainchild. Republican opposition to Wilson, combined with American antipathy toward intervening in European affairs that stretched back to the era of George Washington and his farewell address, left the U.S. looking inward during much of the 1920s and 1930s, decades when the aftermath of the Great War left Europe susceptible to the ideas of strong men who would once more lead the world into war. Remember the learning objectives for this podcast. Write out each one in a sentence or paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen, and watch again. Pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of these learning objectives. Good luck!